us to dive in a little deeper on issues that young people care about, that matter to us, that our peers with the young Republicans and the college Republicans we care about. And so we're excited to be with the governor tonight to be talking about these. And so this is how it's going to go. We're going to have three main topics, like I mentioned: education, economy, and environment. We'll have three different moderators. We'll start with the economy, then go to the environment, end with education. After each segment, there will be a short Q&A, so get prepared with your questions. We'll cycle the moderators in and out quickly, and then we'll end with an opportunity to take photos, say hi to the governor, grab some more food, some beer maybe. We are in a brewery after all, and go from there. So I will welcome Virginia Dry from the New Hampshire Young Republicans up to kick us off with the economy.
Good evening, Governor.
Good evening, Virginia. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you. Thank you for coming back to New Hampshire.
We keep seeing each other at the same bar.
Yeah. But we did meet in Iowa, actually, recently as well.
Yes, we did.
Yes, for the first national meeting of the New Hampshire National Young Republicans. So it was lovely to see you there as well.
Yeah, it was great you were able to
but
make it there.
But we are the first in the nation primary state, and we hold that very, very dear.
As you should.
Yes. So I've had the privilege of talking about one of our issues that we decided to discuss about is the economy. And that is a very, very broad topic. It covers pretty much everything in America. But I want to kind of first give you a moment to say a few words about what is that in your platform as president. But then I have a few questions to follow up on.
Well, I think thank you for that. But number one, let me just start with gratitude. Thank you all for being here tonight. One of the great things about New Hampshire is people like yourself give up your time to be at events like this and really get face-to-face and understand who the candidates are. And so I want to thank Virginia. I want to thank Chris. I want to thank Peter, who owns the Stark Brewery, and his whole staff. Let's give them a hand. Thanks for hosting us tonight. And right off the bat, I want to also acknowledge you got the First Lady of North Dakota is here too. Catherine, if you can raise your hand right there. She's here with us tonight. Doing some amazing work on her own, so wonderful. But on the economy, it is the top issue. I mean, this is the issue we can't fix. If we don't fix that, we're not going to win the Cold War, we're in with China. We're not going to win the proxy wars we're in with Russia and Iran. So we've got to fix that. And the Biden administration is 180 degrees wrong on everything. I mean, whether it's inflation, high interest rates, the national debt spending, you go down the line, it all has to be fixed. And each one of those could be an entire economics class, but let me just say what we've done in North Dakota, where we've got the highest GDP of any Republican-led state in the nation. We've got the highest workforce participation. We've got the highest GDP growth going on right now. All the things, but how do we get there? How do we get to that spot compared to where we were 7 years ago when I took office and we had a huge budget deficit? Well, we cut spending. We cut $1.7 billion out of the budget. If you had a debate stage and said, to get on the debate stage instead of talking about cutting government spending, you actually would have to have done it, I'd be the only guy on stage. Because other people talk about cutting government spending and they're just slowing the growth from 10% to 8%. So you cut the spending, then you cut the red tape, and then you get the red tape off of business owners like Peter here and off of families, and then all of a sudden that lowers their cost. And you do those two things, and then you don't print a bunch of money and overspend at the government, which drives inflation. That lowers costs. And then you fix our energy policies, because the energy policies are also driving inflation in our country right now. So you take care of all that, and all of a sudden your economy starts just screaming, and capital flows to where you've got a stable environment. So in North Dakota, where we're cutting taxes and we're cutting regulation, we have $40 billion of capital projects coming towards North Dakota. How do I know to pull these levers? Well, I spent my entire career in the private sector until I was a governor. If you also had a debate stage and said, to get on this debate stage, you have to have created actual jobs in the private sector, risked your own capital to start businesses, then there'd be very few people on that stage. And if you said, when I looked down the stage, I thought I've created more jobs than everybody else up here combined. And so part of that is that experience and understanding, because to actually be in the executive branch, governor or president, I don't think you should. I think a a debate criteria and an actual criteria should be, if you haven't worked in the private sector, then you shouldn't even be running for that job, because we've seen what happened under Obama. We've seen what's happened under Biden when you take people that are career politicians and you put them in the White House. They have these ideas about that you can print money and it's all going to be fine, and it's actually, inflation specifically has come in. If you've got a savings account, it's come like a thief in the night and stolen about 20 or 25% of the value in that account. And if
It's really a hidden tax.
What's that? It is exactly, Virginia. It's a hidden tax, and it's an insidious one because it hurts the poorest people the most. The people that have to put food on the table and drive their car to get to work are the ones that get hit or hurt the most by Biden inflation.
Well, and to get, because it's a perfect lead into my first question. So inflation is a hidden tax, but not only that, but it affects everything. But with the economy as well, it affects housing, affects what can we do for myself, trying to find anything that's even reasonable for rent, let alone even finding a supply for a house if I ever want to get one, is almost impossible, specifically here in New Hampshire. Where I live, there's over 10,000 units short. But it's a catch-22. The economy is really where one problem is solved, 10 others pop up. And as governor and also as president, how do you see that as, not as a deterrence as the highest office, but how do you fix those problems that are connected, so tightly connected to each other?
Well, they're tightly connected in part because we have inflation because of the overspending at the federal government. And when the federal government says, oh, everybody loves roads and bridges, we'll spend $1 trillion on infrastructure. Well, you do that. And take an example again in North Dakota, you do that, and then we're like, oh, we have all this federal money, we got to go fix our roads. Well, then you go out and bid for roads, and the roads are 30% higher. If I was in the private sector, I'd be like, oh, well, we can't build that road. It doesn't pencil out. None of the math works. Okay? But no, we build 70 miles of road instead of 100 miles of road. And every other state is doing that. The federal government is doing that. So the spending is just going on. You're sucking up all the labor, the concrete, the rebar, all that. So then you go to this house that you're looking for, 10,000, all of that is getting sucked into government spending. And then they go, oh, inflation, we got to raise interest rates. So then we raise interest rates, and it makes the dream of home ownership just out of reach for everyone. And then guess what? People stop building new homes because for them it's not penciling out. So now we've got a screeching halt going on multifamily and new home construction because of the high interest rates and because of the inflation costs. But guess what? We could end up with an economy that is stagnating, but we still have inflation because of all the government spending. It's called stagflation. So it takes a special skill to actually make that happen. Mm-hmm. And the Biden administration figured out how to do it because, all of this spending at the same time you're raising interest rates. So those two things together. So but the reverse of that cycle is just do that. Cut the spending, lower the inflation, lower the interest rates, get rid of the red tape, and then watch the economy come roaring back.
But as president, you also have to work. You're not the only branch. You have two other branches that you have to work with. How do you deal with, particularly with Congress and all the people who have to create those who have also other ideas as well for decreasing spending and also to decrease inflation?
Well, the beautiful thing about being president right now, and divided Congresses are tough if you believe, hey, that we're trying to jam a bunch of policies down on the other party. But when it comes to spending, the spending bills only reach you if everybody's passed, and then you veto them, and guess what? Neither party can gather the votes to override your veto. So right now, the executive branch has a huge role to play in a divided Congress in being able to veto, and actually the president right now actually could stop all this crazy spending if they just exercise their veto capability.
So I have one more question for you, and yes. So inflation for the economy as well. So it's, as we said, this is an intimate conversation. This is not just sound bites and things like that. But there's some different, constant questions that we get all the time. It's like, well, how do you picture a healthy economy? You can say job growth. You can say this is down, this is up. What do you have as a picture of a good, healthy economy?
Well, I think part of a healthy economy is we have to have healthy families and healthy cities. Mm-hmm. And right now, we know that we're headed the wrong direction. We have a behavioral health, mental health crisis going on in our country, and that's contributing to workforce. There's 32 million people in our country right now that are suffering from the disease of addiction. 15 million children are living in homes where at least one parent has got the disease of addiction. That's having a huge impact on workforce, and it's having an impact because if you have addiction plus mental health, then that drives a bunch of the issues related to homelessness, including among our veterans. And then we take a look at what's happening in our large cities, and the large cities are all falling apart. I was in an event earlier today down in Massachusetts. 1,100 people a week are leaving Massachusetts.
And coming to New Hampshire.
Some of them are coming here. Some of them are. But 142,000 people left there last year. I mean, so it is. People are voting with their feet. But when the ones that are leaving Massachusetts, the ones that can afford to move to New Hampshire, the ones that can afford to move someplace else, and so the ones that are staying are the ones that are on those services. So part of the economy is. We've got a workforce issue, but we can solve the workforce issue. We can secure the border and still solve the workforce issue, and some of that goes back to the topic we're coming up later on education. So all these things do tie together.
They do. And as we said, it's the economy affects everything. So whether that's energy, whether that is, again, education, it affects everything in the household. And that's what brings conservatives to the table. You could say you're financially conservative. This is bringing people to the Conservative Party, and that's the topic of this discussion, is to bring the future of conservatism. What do you bring as a candidate, specifically that conservatism on the economy?
Well, I think...
And does that draw to us in the room?
Well, I think everybody would understand that my private sector experience makes me understand how government is not the solution. Government gets in the way. We say innovation, not regulation, is the answer to every problem. The current administration we have has never seen a problem they can't fix with more and more regulation, and it's actually terrifying. People should know. I mean, as a governor of a state that produces food and produces energy, and a lot of both of those things, we are under assault right now from the Biden administration. They're running a swarm of different regulatory regimes to try to shut down U.S. energy, trying to affect U.S. agriculture with their green dream fantasy that they have about energy policy, which we'll talk about. But we're fighting 28 different initiatives. There's like 6 from Bureau of Land Management, another half a dozen from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the EPA, there's even more. And all of these require us to spend millions of dollars on lawyers and teams in every agency we have. We've taken them to court, and we've won on Waters of the USA. We won on oil leasing. But it is incredible, the assault that's happening right now. And all of that raises cost for all of you, because that kind of regulatory regime makes it costlier to raise energy. It makes it costlier to produce food. I mean, the basic things that we need. And so one of the things, innovation, not regulation. We say treat the taxpayer like the customers they are. Mm-hmm. And then we say, look, we've got to, on energy, we have to say we want to be selling energy to our friends and allies and stop buying it from our adversaries. And those are 3 things that, people need to know that I think are all super fiscally conservative, because it gets, smaller government, mm-hmm. follow the 10th Amendment, get a bunch of the stuff that the federal government is not supposed to be doing, and get that back to the states, or to the people, like the 28-word 10th Amendment says. Do that, and then do what the government is supposed to do, because one of the things they're supposed to do is secure the border, and they're not securing the border. And in Massachusetts, they got a bill out now, another $250 million of emergency spending to pay for. I mean, a woman today say to me that she's got a friend who's disabled who can't get into any kind of housing, and then they're paying in Massachusetts for illegal immigrants to stay in motels. I mean, of course that infuriates her in that state. But this ought to be a time for people like yourself and conservative Republicans to take back some of these blue states, because the math just doesn't work. I don't care how big your heart is, the math doesn't work. We can't be spending that kind of money on those kinds of things when part of national security equals border security.
Excellent. So I'm going to open up the floor. So does anybody have, young Republicans, college Republicans, or members of the ACC would like to ask some questions for the governor? So yeah, James, please.
Hello, Governor. My name is James Tebow. I'm actually the chairman of the New Hampshire Legislative Youth Advisory Council, and I'm actually going to be voting for the first time in this primary. So my question is regarding like a specific economic policy that I'm wondering if you would endorse. In Canada, the Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre, has endorsed a policy of not increasing spending for anything by 1 penny unless there's 1 penny of budget cuts found. Rand Paul has also introduced or recommended a similar policy in the past. Would you support something like that?
Well, I'm actually would go further. I mean, I think we can actually cut government spending. I mean, this is something that flattens it, but like I said, nobody thought it was possible. I mean, we took 27% out of the North Dakota budget my first 4 months in office, and people said the whole place is going to fall down, and every train still ran on time. And part of this, having spent, I mean, I grew up in a small town, ag background, but I spent 30 years in technology. And in technology, in the business we were in, you had to be better, faster, and cheaper tomorrow than you were today. That pressure never hits government, and a lot of things that government does, they have no competition. So the competition's got to come from leader. I mean, the pressure to improve incentives have got to be created by leadership. That's what we've done. And so then if you take a look at almost every government job, even if you get the most dedicated, selfless people that went into government service because they wanted to make a difference. You're a highway patrolman, you're a county public health nurse. I mean, you could hey, I could be making more money in the private sector. You see that all the time. They went to it because they care, but inside of every one of those 2 million jobs at the federal level, there's at least 20% of what they do that is some mind-numbing, soul-sucking work that nobody cares about. I mean, they're writing a report that it hasn't been read for 30 years. They're running around with a pickup and a clipboard trying to collect some data for some regulation all that data could be collected automatically and sent in another way. Or maybe we don't even need the data because there's a whole new innovative solution where you're looking at yesterday's problem. So every time these regulations get added, then they often never go away. So I know that by redesigning the work, like the private sector has to when they come under competitive pressure, you can get rid of all that, and guess what? They're happier. The team members in North Dakota are happier than they've ever been. Their work is more meaningful and more purposeless because we passed 50 more red tape reduction bills this year. That's year 7 of my thing. We didn't run out of ideas. We did everything that we wanted to do. Then we did everything that the team wanted to do. And then this last year we started crowdsourcing from the public, saying, send us your ideas of red tape that we can get rid of. And when you do that, you can actually lower the size of government. And so I think there's an opportunity.
Having the public engagement of the government. Yes.
Here's the website. Send us your ideas. How is this getting in your way as opposed to helping? I mean, it's like, let's just get after it. Because guess what? There's 10 million jobs open in the private sector. If you got rid of 400,000, that'd be 20% of the federal workers. They'd all have jobs tomorrow. This is the one perfect time to actually shrink, because you wouldn't be adding to the unemployment rolls. You could get people back where they're paying taxes as opposed to consuming taxes. But thanks, James, and thanks for getting engaged, and good luck on your first voting experience.
Any more questions for the governor? It's in the back.
It's all good. Tom talking. So yeah, I'm curious a little bit about what cutting red tape would look like in practice. You talked about how dividing Congress would be helpful for stopping spending with retail power. At the same time, a lot of these environmental laws, they will require an act of Congress for any sweeping reform. Granted, you can do some stuff at the state level, but I know, for example, you've had to contend with the Water Act a lot, Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act hasn't been amended since 1990. Clean Water Act, it's been a while as well. So I guess I'm just curious, with the dividing Congress, what do sweeping reforms around these environmental laws look like?
Well, I think that where we're seeing it with this divided Congress, all of the new regs are coming from executive orders. I mean, they're coming at, the rulemaking that's coming at us from these different agencies is not coming from Congress. It is like complete new interpretations by the EPA of stuff that got passed in the 1970s, and it's way out of bounds, and that's why we end up in court. So, I think that you've got to have a president who's been on the receiving end, like a governor of a state where we're just getting barraged, because I would walk in on day one and go, here's the 1,000 things that we're going to reverse. Just get rid of the executive order. I don't believe that we ought to the president ought to have unmitigated powers, because I believe in limited federal government. I think the president ought to be doing what the federal government is supposed to do. But day one, you've got to get rid of a bunch of the stuff that Biden is laying on top of the states and the companies and the industries to do that, because it's driving up the cost of everything. It is driving inflation. It's like we're gonna eliminate gas stoves. But you can't.
There was a bill to eliminate wood stoves in New Hampshire at one point.
Yeah, and then here you are in New Hampshire, and New Hampshire's got the highest percentage of any state in the nation where people still heat their homes with heating oil. And at the time of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was 400,000 barrels of Russian heating oil being offloaded into New England. Why? Because you can't get a pipeline built through New York to get clean natural gas from the Marcellus Shale up here. I mean, that's a tax on, because the heating oil costs more. So if you care about the environment, you'd want to have every ounce of energy produced in the United States. We've got enough to take care of all of ourselves and our allies to do that. But no, with all of these regulations stuff, and there's, I think, oh, you couldn't do that in New York. I thought you believed in states' rights. I believe in states' rights, but I also believe in national security. If the president has the authority to do things by executive order, if we've got in Long Beach, California, offloading foreign oil, and we're offloading it here in New England because you can't get a pipeline from the Permian Basin in Texas over to LA because it's being blocked by a bunch of, quote, environmentalists that want to save the planet, but then we're going to get dirty fuel from another country. I mean, then we have to just say, no, there's some things like national security. All lower 48 states should be able to have access to clean energy produced in the United States without any imports. We should probably do that. We should probably refill the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as opposed to, Biden lowers it by half ahead of the midterms to try to get the price down at the pump. And meanwhile, China's filling their Strategic Petroleum Reserve to the highest levels with oil that's coming from where? Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, 3 countries where two of them, Iran and Venezuela, where we've lifted oil sanctions. Russia, our oil sanctions aren't working. And China is the world's largest importer of oil and gas, 10 million barrels of oil a day. So connect all those dots, and that explains all the reason why we're having global instability right now. Goes back to these crazy energy policies that hurt the U.S. They hurt the United States. They hurt international and national stability, and they raise the cost of everything for everybody here, and they make the environment less clean. You can't offload our environmental life, our future to China, the world's largest CO2 emitter, and say that somehow us getting batteries from them is going to clean up the environment. That is a complete fantasy.
So we have one more question for this topic, the economy. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So thank you for speaking with us.
Thank you,
on this
Virginia.
topic. We're going to reintroduce Chris for the topic of the environment. So thank you.
Good. We had a good lead in right there at the end. So thank you, Virginia. Welcome back, Chris.
Thank you, Governor. Let's talk about the environment, an issue that is notoriously easy for Republicans to talk about, right? I actually want to kick off by talking about your record, which I find very interesting because you're governor of North Dakota, an oil and gas state. Yet I took a few notes. You've done some really interesting stuff on environmental issues. In 2017, you created the state's first Department of Environmental Quality. In 2021, when you were reelected, you announced a goal for North Dakota to be carbon neutral by 2030. You've embraced carbon capture and storage technology and an all-of-the-above energy strategy. That's all really ambitious stuff on the environment, but you've also done that while maintaining economic growth and those other things that also really matter. Could you talk a little bit about why you care about this issue and what you've done and what your track record as governor looks like on it?
Well, I think this ties into your organization and everything that you guys are working for, because we can solve every problem that's facing this planet environmentally or otherwise through innovation. We can't solve it with regulation. Absolutely, innovation is what's going to get us there. So when we set the goal to be the first state to be carbon neutral by 2030, I announced that at an oil and gas conference. And everyone's like, what? And it's like, yeah, but no new regulations, no new mandates. Actually, we're going to keep doing what we're doing. That was 2.5 years ago, and we've just kept cutting red tape. And now our oil production is as high as it's ever, almost as high as it's ever been. Our natural gas production hit a new high last month. And we are in a position to, through carbon sequestration and carbon utilization, enhanced oil recovery, able to take care of all these issues. You don't have to stop using liquid fuels to solve the CO2 problem. You just need to have innovation. And we've got a company that is capturing CO2 off of a gas plant in Wyoming. They built a 105-mile pipeline that comes through Montana into southwestern North Dakota into one of our older 1980s oil fields. They take that CO2, they compress it, it becomes the liquid. They put it down old oil wells that they're not using down into that oil field. The CO2 stays down there, oil comes up, and every barrel of oil that comes up produces 500. There's 500 more pounds of CO2 staying down than that barrel of oil comes up. They're the first carbon negative oil company in America. They're greener than Patagonia. Okay, Patagonia says we're going to be carbon neutral. These guys are carbon negative in terms of what they're putting in the ground. And so then all of a sudden, okay, now guess what? We don't need to get rid of internal combustion machines. We don't need to subsidize 500,000 EV charging stations across America with your taxpayer dollars. We don't need to pay $7,500 for someone to buy an EV that has a battery that's made in China. And then if it's made in China, because they control 85% of the rare earth minerals, it's being also made in a plant in China that is powered by coal. Because of they've got 260 coal plants permitted. They're opening up one a week right now. They have more coal plants already than we have in the U.S. I mean, the Washington Post 3 weeks ago praising China for their adoption of EVs. Like, aren't they amazing compared to the U.S.? Look at this. They're adopting EVs faster than we are. The whole article, I read the whole thing. It never mentioned the source of electricity. The source of electricity for all those EVs in China is coal plants. There's nothing about those EVs that are saving the planets. They're making it actually, they're emitting more CO2. And so this is, we can solve it with innovation. But what I'd like to say is, I mean, and with ethanol is the easiest thing. When you cook corn, two things happen. You get alcohol comes off it like a bootlegger still in the 1930s, and then guess what? CO2 goes into the atmosphere. But that CO2 coming off that corn process of cooking that corn, it's 99.5% CO2. You can capture that. You can use it for food grade carbonation for beverages. You can put it in a pipeline, ship it to North Dakota. We put it in the ground for permanent storage. Or I was literally at a meeting, what's today? Say Wednesday? Yesterday morning, I was leading the Industrial Commission meeting in North Dakota, which the governor chairs. They passed around a 12-inch by 12-inch slab that looked like a beautiful piece of granite that you would say, wow, that is gorgeous. Could I get that? Is that a sample? I could get that for my countertop and my island and my new, high-end home. Could I use it as a backsplash? 30% of the weight of that slab was CO2. You're like, what are you talking about? No, they take CO2, you inject it into other materials, you use an epoxy that it comes from a specialized epoxy. It seals the CO2 inside there. They're making cinder blocks. They're now making I knew they were making cinder blocks because now they have a lighter weighter thing. Think of all the construction materials where cement is a high CO2 emitter. That can be actually, instead of emitting CO2 to make cement, you can actually use it as a place to store CO2 in. So I just say, great, give us all the CO2 you want, because with advanced materials, we'll put it everywhere. They're working on a project now to create a new form of asphalt where the CO2 is actually in the asphalt, as opposed to some concrete is one of the reasons why China is the world's largest emitter is because they are producing more concrete than anyone else, and they do it in a way that's super CO2 inefficient. So innovation could solve all of these problems. So your whole organization is about, hey, let's get out of this fantasy world. Well, the answer is going to be innovation. So the record we have is because I'm chasing innovation is what we're doing, and we're super excited about the future. And the other thing with CO2, in North Dakota, we're a huge ag producer. Guess what? We produce agricultural products 5 months a year. You may have heard we have a thing called winter up there, okay? So we're not growing stuff in the wintertime, but we have all this excess heat that's coming off the stuff. We've got one of our tribes is building one of the largest greenhouses in the nation. They've got all the technology from where your connections and family is from. I mean, they've been to the Netherlands like 3 times where all the cutting edge greenhouses. They're building these greenhouses in North Dakota in the northern plains. They're going to take this excess CO2 coming off of these industrial processes, and they're going to stick it in the greenhouse. And guess what? When you have a CO2 enhanced environment, like 30% enhanced CO2, you get the tomatoes grow faster. I mean, that's plants love CO2. They suck it up, they grow faster, and then they kick out oxygen as part of that process we all learned about in junior high. So it is like there are so many ways we can utilize the CO2 for beneficial use. That's the core of how we envision getting to 2030. But by putting the shingle out and saying we can get carbon neutral, then that's where the $40 billion in capital came, because everybody started coming and saying, like in Minnesota, they said, wow, we've shut down mining in Minnesota. We had some guys come to us this last summer, and they said, we've got the rights to 40 years worth of iron ore sitting on top of the ground in Minnesota that Minnesota won't let us mine. Could we stick it on a train, bring it to North Dakota, process it into pig iron, capture the CO2 and stick the CO2 underground? Yes, good, because we'll have the first carbon neutral pig iron, and we're going to end up with a $10 billion steel plant on the back end of that pig iron factory, and we'll have low carbon intensive steel. And then you're saying, and nobody has to even believe in climate change. I mean, does anybody? I've like milk. I've had milk my whole life. I cannot explain why someone will pay twice as much for a carton of organic milk as regular milk, because regular milk is fine for me, but some people are willing to pay the margin. There are markets all over the world where people will pay for low carbon intensive products. And like sustainable aviation fuel, the United States can be the world leader in that because we can decarbonize all of our ethanol. So this could be a boon we could be exporting technology to solve these problems as opposed to killing the U.S. energy industry and letting that, because when you kill the U.S. energy industry, all you do is reduce supply. You don't reduce demand. The demand is still there. The demand gets filled by other countries that produce it less cleanly. So that's the biggest lie of all this stuff, of we're going to somehow regulate CO2 out of the U.S. thinking that that's going to be a net negative for the world. It won't be. It'll be a net positive in terms of CO2, or a net increase in CO2 emissions, because everybody else does it dirtier than we do.
Yeah, what I find really interesting about your approach to these issues is, rather than denying the problem, you just pivot to solutions. And I think a lot of the kind of instinct that we've seen for quite a while among Republicans is, oh, we don't like the left's solutions, so we're going to reject the problems altogether. We're not going to talk about the environmental problems that exist. We're not going to talk about climate change. And we just kind of like accept that the left's narrative is wrong and the solutions suck. And to be clear, like, a lot of the solutions do suck. Like, you've talked about why they do suck, but we need to come with our own more positive vision of why conservative solutions rooted in innovation and American leadership are going to be better. And it was interesting being at the first presidential debate and seeing the climate change question come up, which came up from one of our members, actually, and kind of seeing that dichotomy on the debate stage between, like, those who said, yes, it's real, let's talk about the solutions, versus those that said, it's not real. And we know that this is an issue that really matters to young people, increasingly so, but it also matters to young conservatives. There's a poll the other day that found that 81% of young Republicans believe that climate change is real, we need to do something about it. My question to you is, if you were to be elected president, what's your vision of a conservative climate agenda that you would pitch to the country?
Well, it would be on the lines of what we talked about, which is, if you want to do EVs with Biden right now, the way Biden is doing it, then you're on Team China. I mean, get all our batteries from them. Don't produce rare earth minerals here. Don't do nuclear here, because they're shutting down uranium mining in our country by creating national monuments, doing other things, and we're getting our uranium. We have 93 nuclear plants in this country. It takes you 30 years to permit one, and we're buying our uranium from Russia, who we're in a proxy war with. I mean, it's just like completely goofy. But I'm a believer in all of the above. But liquid fuels, decarbonizing liquid fuels is cheaper, faster, and better for the environment than this whole EV thing, because we don't have the recycling figured out. On the EVs, EV fires. I mean, I was meeting with fire chiefs in Iowa last week, and they're like, wow, if we ever have one of these fires in a parking ramp. Why in a parking ramp? Because they can't get a fire truck in a parking ramp. The ceiling height isn't high enough. And then the amount of water to put out an EV fire is like 5 times as much as it takes to put out another one. And then you're in a parking ramp, and all those toxic fluids are going down. So people haven't thought through the whole cycle of, like, it's just like, oh, EV is great, let's subsidize them. No, I mean, they're creating a whole new set of problems. I mean, we're working on a project. We're doing R&D in North Dakota on a wind blade recycling. That's going to be a huge issue. We're a huge wind producer, but everyone's like, oh, well, let's subsidize wind for 20 years and not think anything. What do you do with these massive, I mean, some of these wind blades are now 83 meters long, one blade. That's 250 feet long for a blade. I mean, there's no thought about, they're not going, you can't put them in a landfill because of all the polymers and the plastics and all the stuff that are in there. So we're again, innovation would be the message, and it would be like a Team USA message as opposed to a Team China, because we've got the ability to innovate our way through these solutions as opposed to just saying, no, we're going to kill this old thing and then get all of our new stuff from them. Last thing I'll say on this, which is, ties in, because you mentioned Theodore Roosevelt when we were talking earlier, but this is critical for all of you to understand. When Theodore Roosevelt was president, the original, cradle of conservation, where that came from, was from when he was ranching in North Dakota. The Elkhorn Ranch is considered literally the cradle of conservation. He went out there to do one thing, and then he saw the West was disappearing, he saw what was happening, and it developed his whole ethic around that. That ranch of his is now in the middle of Theodore Roosevelt National Park, which is the only park in the nation named after an individual, not named after a place. But he put away 240 million acres of federal land around the nation, 240 million acres. The largest landowner in America is the federal government. The largest mineral owner in the in the nation is the federal government. The largest timber owner in the United States is the federal government. And you know what the Biden administration wants? And this whole green fantasy thing is they don't want anybody to set foot on that. They want it to be wilderness. They don't want to cut a tree. They don't want to mine minerals. They don't want to mine, rare earth minerals for batteries. They want to do oil production. We've sued and won. I mean, every president since Harry Truman has held the lawfully required once a quarter lease sales where the federal government would lease their land to a private sector to do oil and gas development. They have not now for 10 quarters have refused to hold the lease sales. They're just literally blatantly, violating the law. So part of the message is to young and old Republicans is, look, this is your land. Does not belong to unelected bureaucrats that work for Joe Biden. The land belongs to the American people, and if we're going to win a Cold War with China and win these proxy wars, we have to bring our balance sheet to the party. And we have the strongest balance sheet in the world relative to untapped minerals, rare earth minerals, uranium, all the stuff we need for an all-above strategy. And guess what? If you do it in the United States, it'll be done cleanly and it'll matter. Because like you asked me, like in North Dakota, wherever, nobody cares more about the land than the people that live there. It's not some bureaucrat in Washington that's going to tell a fifth-generation North Dakota farm family that you should care about clean water or soil health or clean air. No, they're raising their families there. We care about it. Guess what? We're doing everything I've talked about, and go look who's on the top of the list for clean air and clean water in the nation. North Dakota's always at the top of that list. And so it's like we can do it all. You can do it all and just get rid of this idea that somehow you can regulate your way to a solution. It's innovation that's going to get us there.
I appreciate you mentioning Teddy Roosevelt. We consider him the godfather of our organization because I think a lot of this is not just the technical, scientific aspect of the innovation, the technologies, but a lot of it's also philosophical, right? It's like, as conservatives, our instinct is to conserve. And that can be institutions, that can be our way of life, and that can also be the land that we all love, that we hunt on, that our farmers rely on. And I think this philosophical angle is one that Republicans and conservatives need to be able to lean a lot more in on, because you've talked about it, a lot of the solutions that we get from the left sound good, but they aren't actually good in practice. And whether it's with forest management or whether it's with subsidizing EVs that will just end up relying on China for, a lot of what we need to be doing is turning this narrative on its head, that conservatives care about conservation. We can tackle climate change with innovation, and that's in our DNA. It's actually not an oxymoron. It's two in the same, right? And so I'd love to get your thoughts before we open it up to the floor, just on that philosophical angle. Like, how can conservatives win this battle of ideas on the environment and tell young people in this country that care so much about climate change and are overwhelmingly voting for the left that actually our approach is better?
Well, I think it's better because it actually works. I mean, if you want a net result of saying, hey, we want to, have clean air, clean water, clean soil, we want to do that, and the U.S. wants to do it. I mean, it's like we have to do it here. We cannot outsource. We can't outsource this, or, you can't outsource our, whatever environmental guilt to other countries. I mean, I'll give you two examples. One is in Alaska, there's the Alaska oil pipeline, which is, quite famous, built in the 1970s. Everybody heard about it, opened up the North Slope. It goes hundreds and hundreds of miles from north to south and has never had a major spill. And the thing is built, it's built above ground where it's above frozen tundra, so it doesn't use the heat to affect the sensitive Arctic environment. It's got shock absorbers for seismic activities. The thing is amazing. And before COVID, a Russian delegation came over and met with Governor Mike Dunleavy, a friend that's governor of Alaska, and said, hey, tell us about the pipeline, because we're thinking about, you know, building one in Russia, because they've got to move it like 7 time zones to get it to the ports, you know, near Europe before it could even begin its journey to New England, the dirty Russian oil I'm talking about, okay? So they say, how much does it move a day? And he's like, well, 500,000 barrels a day. And they're like, no, we need 2 numbers. And he goes, what do you mean, 2 numbers? And they said, well, in Russia, each pipeline has 2 numbers. And he goes, what do you mean? He goes, well, there's the number we put in the beginning, and then there's the number that comes out the end. And so there is so much spillage along the way, they actually track 2 different numbers. It's either pirated or it's spilled. And in a place like North Dakota or Alaska or Wyoming or Texas, I mean, if you have a spill, reportable spills vary by state, but in North Dakota, I mean, if you spill a bucket worth of oil, it's a reportable incident. And it's reported to the county, to the state, to whatever. And if it's spilled, it's on an oil pad, you know, which has been constructed and inspected, that's got berms, it can't get on the soil. I mean, and when we're doing, I mean, a North Dakota well, we go down 2 miles and then use technology to go sideways for at least 2 miles, some now 3, some 4. They're staying in a 30-foot strip. You've heard of the word the Bakken, where all this oil's coming from? The Bakken is a geologic formation that's only 30 feet thick. I was in an oil drilling shack, and it's not like some 1950s, you know, black and white, you know, movie where everybody's covered with oil and the stuff spraying all over. No, it's like kids with 2 college degrees in computer science and physics that are, you know, doing the geotechnical work. And I said, how do you possibly go down 2 miles and then go over 2 miles and not get outside of a 30-foot strip? They're 10,000 feet underground when they're doing this. They're 2 miles underground. That's less than 1/3 of 1% tolerance that you could move. And he said, sir, if your house was 2 miles down and 2 miles over, I could drill the lockout on the front door. I mean, they have that much precision in what they're doing. And now we've permitted this year more 3-mile laterals and 4-mile laterals. So all that drilling activity across 4 square miles is occurring on a spot that might be less than 4 acres. So the surface impact is almost nothing, and it's all controlled, you know, versus other places in the world. No way they're doing anything in or close to what we're doing here. So we have such an opportunity to be an exporter of technology to other places, or we can export our energy, because, by the way, you want global stability. South Korea, Philippines, Japan, all completely energy dependent, all getting that from Indonesia, the Middle East, and now we have China with the world's largest navy ready to blockade Taiwan. If they do that, the stock market will crash the next day, every price will go higher, it's going to make COVID supply chains look like nothing. 30% of the world's economy goes through the South China Sea. So if they make a move there, and then guess what? Our allies, like my dad was in the U.S. Navy in World War II fighting, made it all the way to Japan. They import 100% of their oil and gas. They have no oil and gas. And then we could be supplying that from Alaska with clean energy, but no, Biden administration said, oh, we're going to allow some drilling in Alaska. That Strategic Petroleum Reserve area in Alaska is the size of Indiana. They've permitted and allowed the size of 2 square miles, like size of like a golf course, is all that the Biden administration has done. So we're not only hurting our own U.S. energy industry and raising costs here, we're also doing it for our allies. So when I say sell energy to our friends and allies versus buy it from our adversaries, the world gets cleaner. Global, you know, dictators, brutal dictators that are brutalizing their people in their countries, they lose a bunch of power because they're getting their power and their funding, like Iran, the world's largest sponsor of terrorism, getting all their revenue from oil exports, which we're now allowing. So you stop inflation, you stabilize the world, and you strengthen our allies. I mean, you can't separate energy policy from national security from the economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's also why it's so important for the U.S. to lead on carbon capture technology, because we can't just export our energy, we can also export our technology. And if we can help those countries that are using our oil and gas, first of all, it has lower emissions, but for the emissions that do still exist, we can help them reduce those as well with the technology. Let's open it to the floor. I'm sure there's a few questions, so just put up your hand and I'll call on you if you have any.
Hi there, Margaret Kennedy with New Hampshire Young Republicans. I'm the vice chair. Thank you so much for coming tonight. So my question revolves around clean energy. As president, how would you encourage our country's governors to consider clean energy such as nuclear power and integrating it into their plans moving forward so we could have cleaner energy in America?
Thank you for the question, and thanks for your leadership. The nuclear energy one is interesting because that's one area where a lot of this stuff should be handled by the states, but the nuclear stuff, the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Agency, and a lot of the stuff that belongs under the Department of Energy, they're the ones that have created all the red tape where it literally takes 30 years to get a plant built. There is and when those plants, the ones that have been built, the ones we think about, the ones you've seen in the movies, they're all like 1,100 or 1,500 megawatts. But there's some really exciting stuff that's going on. We got to have a whole new regulatory regime for small nuclear, because there's some 10 megawatt units that are being developed. Wyoming is working on one of these in coal country there. You know, there's places in Alaska where they have no electricity, and we're not going to build a power line for 250 miles across the wilderness to get to a small remote village in Alaska. But we could give them a 10 megawatt self-contained nuclear reactor, which is built in a place like Wyoming, and we ship it up there and drop it in, and it doesn't take 30 years to permit and build. And so those small form factor ones, that's a whole new thing where for rural areas, for military bases around the rural world, we could be doing those. So there's a bunch of innovation that could happen around nuclear that's different than the way we've done it at this, the way the U.S. historically, or the way France has done on this large scale thing that scares everybody. But let's just also understand that as soon as you say nuclear, everyone's like, well, not in my backyard. There's never been a death from a nuclear plant in the United States. And I've had people ask me, would you live next to a nuclear plant? And I said, sure. And they said, would you have your family live next to one and your kids? And I'm like, sure. And they're like, really? And I go, yeah, well, when we were growing up on the farm and we're raising the kids on the farm, I said, we lived right next to a highway. And they said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, we kill 45,000 people a year on highways, and they were all driving on those highways. We've never killed 45,000 a year, almost consistently my whole life. It used to be higher, then it got below 40,000, now it's back up again. But through all of that, so millions of people have died on our highways, and nobody is afraid of buying a car, basically, but everybody's afraid of a nuclear plant. And it's like, at some point, we got to get into the reality of the facts, which is there's never been a nuclear death in our country because of that. And these new smaller form factors and what they're doing with the nuclear waste, they're solving a bunch of the problems. So again, it's innovation. It's not regulating them, regulating to death. But meanwhile here, there was 100% green hydro power line coming from Quebec, that was going to come down through Maine, and that thing can't get 10 years. They've been trying to get that permitted. And then New York wants to shut down Indian River, which is providing 20%, the nuclear plant, which provides 20% of the electricity. So we're going to shut down nuclear. You can't replace it with hydro, but we're going to build, at least 20% or more, or 30% of those 500,000 charging stations would have to be in the northeastern part of the U.S. because that's where the population is and that's where the cars is. So we don't have a grid to actually provide the power to go to those charging stations because we're prematurely shutting down baseload, we're shutting down nuclear, but somehow in this fantasy world, we're going to have enough charging stations that are actually going to work to charge these EVs, which the fire departments, can't put the fires out on. So the physics doesn't work and the economics doesn't work. And there's one estimate that if you just implemented all the things they're talking about, including we're going to ban gas stoves and all that other stuff, that would be another $137 billion a year tax on consumers because you'd have to replace 200 million electrical appliances in the United States and then not have a power grid. I mean, you're replacing 200,000 gas-powered appliances with electric ones at the same time we want to have electric cars. So we're not going to have electric homes, electric cars, and electric everything, but we don't have the grid or we don't have the base transmission, and you can't get a power plant permitted, and you can't get a transmission line permitted. So again, when I say fantasy because none of it adds up to the math to actually implement it, but they're charging ahead with the 500,000 charging stations with your taxpayer money.
I think there's a really strong argument to be made that those that have opposed nuclear energy have actually done the most harm to being able to bring clean electricity on the grid and tackle climate change in this country. And similar, you mentioned permitting reform and the importance of changing regulations. Right now, it's government red tape that's the number one obstacle to clean energy coming on the grid because we simply can't permit it, whether it's a nuclear plant or a hydro plant or wind and solar. None of that stuff can get built because of government red tape. Any other questions? Yeah. You want to shout it out?
Yeah, I'll just shout it. quality of regulations are very different. What are you going to do as president to make sure that the cuts that are being made are being done smartly and are done effectively to meet your ends?
Well, I think we'd apply the same approach that we've done in North Dakota, where we've been doing this, which is we want to make sure that we're doing two things, which is we want to apply the law and apply the science, and then get rid of the ideology. I mean, we're data driven, not ideologically driven. So it's like, and if the goal is we want to have clean, safe, stable, low cost power, then how do we get there? Well, you don't get there through some ideology. You get there through, and which turns out the best way to get there is through innovation, not regulation.
So just a quick follow-up on that. If coal is not cost-effective without government subsidies, would you support further leasing and coal industry?
Well, in North Dakota, coal is cost effective without government subsidies. And the issue then, if you say it's not about the coal, it's about the CO2, then you'd say, well, then can we take CO2 off of coal? And the answer is yes. And where all of our lignite coal, which lies just below the surface of the ground, so we don't do mining like you think of like West Virginia. This is like take off the topsoil. There's literally like 12 to 20 feet of coal that's right there. You load it in a truck, you put it back, and I mean, I could drive you to places that 40 years ago were a lignite coal mine in North Dakota, and you're going to be like, I don't believe you, because people are just farming and grazing and cows. Because if you do all that reclamation with the way we've done it there, you can't even tell it's ever been developed. But the key thing for us going forward, if we're in a battle with rare earth minerals, the reason why they call them rare earth minerals is they occur in parts per million. I mean, like very small things. Some of the highest concentrations now of the study that's been done by the U.S. Geologic Survey across our nation, some of the highest concentrations of rare earth minerals are in lignite coal in places like North Dakota. It is completely uneconomic to take off the topsoil, go down there with these giant hose, and pull out that lignite and then process 1 million pounds to get enough to do 10 batteries. That's non-economic. China's doing that. I mean, they're tearing up Indonesia, they're tearing up Central Africa, they're tearing up the whole planet with no environmental thing to get those minerals, which they ship back to China to make a battery to send to us. But if you are doing decarbonized, low cost, highly stable, low sulfur, no nitric oxide, no sulfur oxide, because we've figured out the last 30 years how to take all that stuff out. You take all that out, so you got clean base load, and then the process of moving through those millions of pounds of coal gives you an opportunity to economically develop those rare earth minerals. So there's an economic system that's there, and it turns out that all the coal in North Dakota is sitting right on top of the nation's best CO2 storage. We can store all the nation's CO2 for the next 50 years. If you could get the CO2 to North Dakota. We don't have enough of it there right now, but we've got 250 billion tons worth of CO2 storage, 6,000 feet underground, naturally occurring in this 300-foot band of sandstone. So it is so I mean, to your question, I'm not for subsidies, but we've subsidized wind. We're subsidizing, ethanol. We've subsidized almost all these other things that we're doing, and it'd be great if they would all go away and you get back to a market base. But it's hard to have some of them. It's hard to have some of those go away, and it's hard for the private sector because the private sector has made capital commitments based on the fact that they're there. So if they're going to go away, they'd have to be sunsetted way out in the future so that people could make decisions about, am I building this giant plant or not, based on that. But a lot of the, quote, subsidies are actually tax credits, and so nobody gets the credit unless you actually generate the income, and you don't generate the income unless you make billions of dollars of investments. And so that's different than some of the stuff the Biden administration is doing where they're just sending checks to people. I mean, a tax credit has to actually drive capital investment from the private sector first. But anyway, thanks for that good question.
I think it's time to pivot to our final topic on education. Before we do that, just quickly, if people want to learn more about what the American Conservation Coalition Action does on this, it's all about conservatives that care about conservation. We care about the environment, but we do it with the solutions that we talked about today, some of the things that the governor has pioneered in North Dakota. You can check us out at accaction.eco.eco. But thank you for your leadership on this issue. Thank you for your time, and we'll pass it over to the final topic.
And sir, I saw you had your hand up, but I'll be around afterwards. Come and ask me your question, okay? Good evening.
Hi, so I'm Jessica. I am a board member of the New Hampshire College Republicans, and I am also the vice chair of our College Republicans chapter over at the University of New Hampshire. So I kind of want to start out this discussion about kind of your overall policy opinions and aspects of what you believe would be best for the education system in our country, and kind of I want to know what you've done for education in North Dakota.
Well, first of all, thank you for your leadership, and thanks for being here tonight. Happy to report in North Dakota things are working great. We've got among the highest, just reported last month, I think we're at the second highest SAT scores in the country. We've got among the highest number of kids that graduate, percentage of kids that finish, graduate from high school on time. So there's a lot of positive things that are happening. But and a lot of people just stop there and go, hey, we've solved it all. But you've probably picked up that I'm an innovation guy, and one of the things that I've done as governor is I've shadowed students. I call up, I had everybody telling me what's going on in the schools, and I'm like, I actually haven't been in one for a while, and our kids had been out of school for a little bit. I'm like, I'm going back. Call up a school, or first we tell the whole state, tomorrow the governor is going to be shadowing a student. We just don't know where. So they're all kind of like, whoa, that's tomorrow morning? So you don't give them a week to everybody clean up stuff. But then we call them and say, hey, he's coming to your school. And then I show up at 8 o'clock in the morning, and they give us a student. And I don't want the valedictorian. I don't want the homecoming king or queen. I just want a student that is, can be struggling, not struggling. But I'm going with them to every class they go to all day. So I've done this where I've actually seen what high school looks like, so I don't have to have legislators and others tell me what it is. I have not gone to elementary school. I've been going to high school primarily. But it is it's fascinating to actually see that a lot of it hasn't changed from the time that I was there. And then you're like, when I was doing this early on, I'm like, man, we have to, then I go, why is it still the same? Oh, because of this regulation, that regulation, this, we got to do this. Well, we got X number, we got to have 180 days, and they have to have X number of hours, and they have X number of credits, or whatever. And all of this got layered in to where there was almost no flexibility. So we applied the same thing we've done to every place else. And so if you sum the whole thing up, I would just call all the red tape cutting, call it innovation schools. Every school can get a waiver to get out from underneath all these regulations where it's not butts and seats time. It's not sit in a class for 50 minutes and the bell rings and whatever, because we know that young people learn through hands-on, team-based, real-world learning. And one of the things where they're like, oh, we need more of that in school. Well, it turns out in North Dakota, you're like, well, what would be an example of hands-on, team-based, real-world learning? Well, like when kids do a 4-H project, and they're doing this, and they do that, and they work on it for this, and they've got to present it, and it's like, yeah, or like merit badges, like in Boy Scouts or Girls. We're like, okay, well then why wouldn't that count? So we literally passed a law, and all of those different, quote, after-school programs, if a kid has got 5 health-related first aid, first responder merit badges in Boys or Girl Scouts, guess what? They don't have to sit through a half a semester to get a half a credit a health class anymore, because they can go take an AP class or do something else. And then if they've got, a co-op or an internship, or things like that, they can get credit for that if it's structured and it's got hands-on, team-based, real-world learning. So we're just cutting loose on all the innovation. And part of this then is we had kids. We said they've got to be choice ready when they graduate from high school. They got to be ready, not just to go to college. That's a fallacy, because there's 1.6 trillion reasons. That's the amount of college debt that's been piled on America, where we're subsidizing higher ed. So you've got 1.6 trillion there that is super inflationary, and that's all a separate crazy thing. But we said, in addition to college ready, they should be military ready. There's a lot of kids that can't pass the military entrance exam, the physical exam, the academic exam, or the mental health exam, because they didn't know that when they were in junior high and someone gave them a prescription that they're going to have to check a box on their military exam, and then they get booted out because they actually got treated for a real mental health issue. But the kid that's untreated doesn't have to check that box. They can go in the military. So I've talked to the military. That has to change. But on the choice ready, so career ready would be career and technical education. And then what can we do? So we've shoved enormous amounts of dollars towards career and technical education so that kids can get exposed to careers when they're in grade school, because that's literally by 4th grade, that's when some people decide, I'm not good at math, and then they end up like, oh, I'm not going to do computer science, or I'm not doing engineering. No, we've got to expose them to exciting stuff when they're in elementary school. Then they've got to do that's career exposure. Career exploration is junior high. That's when you start doing field trips and following doctors or nurses or engineers around and being like, hey, this is cool, I want to be a fireman and go in the military. Then guess what, in high school, that's too late. You can't do a career fair for a senior in high school and go, oh, this is what you want to be. No, by the time you're in high school, they should actually be getting training. By the time you're 16 years old in places like Germany, you're already working on your apprenticeship. So we've added all of that. So now I've met kids that are in the equivalent of their freshman year, October of their freshman year. They're out of high school for the equivalent of 2 months that already had a $72,000 job offer. How is that possible? Well, they got their half of their associate degree when they were in high school, through a career in technical, and then they were starting on a program for power plant management to run a huge electrical plant, and because everybody that knows how to do that's retiring, and they're desperate for workers, and if you have a 2-year degree and they need young people that understand computers because it's all automated and you're sitting in front of screens. So those guys I met, the 2 of them that had these job offers, it was October. One of them had just bought a new Ford F-150 pickup, had no college debt, and was the company that he was going to work for was going to pay for his college if he wanted to go to his 3rd and 4th year. So choice ready is one thing, cut red tape is another. Turn every school in the state into an innovation school through waivers. That's what we've been working on.
It's pretty awesome. I have to commend you very much for that one. That's awesome. So going into that a little bit, I'm kind of curious, as president, would you support a workforce readiness program in high schools that, expose kids to areas of interest and, would prepare them for graduating high school and going straight into the workforce, or going into trades as opposed to going and getting a 4-year degree? And I also want to add on to that, would you support a community college transfer program? Because here in New Hampshire, we have an agreement with the community college system of New Hampshire and the university system, where actually I started off in a community college and transferred in, and it reduced my student debt significantly.
Yes and yes. That's the affirmatively strong yes on the first one, for sure. But I would add a caveat. I don't believe that the Department of Education is a federal agency, that it belongs as part of that thing. But I'm instead of blowing it up, if either get rid of the money that doesn't matter or shove it all back to the states. And some people have had this as a key part of their running for president. I'm getting rid of the Department of Education. It's 4,000 people. There's 2 million federal employees. It doesn't even put a dent in what we have to do to reduce the federal government, but it is clearly, because it's not that the 4,000 are there, because what they do is they do grants that are tied to a bunch of ideology, that whatever that administration wants to do. And then I'm looking at we've got instead of a 4,000 person Department of Education, we have a 180 person Department of Education in North Dakota. A huge chunk of them, sometimes maybe as many as 50% of them, what are they doing? They're working on applying for and navigating a bunch of federal grants, because they're trying to see, do we fit here or there, whatever. Just do a block grant, give it to the states, let them figure it out. We got 175 school boards, let the decisions made locally, drive it down locally, or just don't spend the money at all, as opposed to try to use that to drive a certain ideology. Other things that we've done, we did pass the law several years ago that you can't graduate from high school unless you can pass the civics, citizen. If you can't pass the test that a new American passing a citizenship to become a citizen, if you can't pass that 100-question test, you don't get to graduate from high school. So that's just a basic thing. And then the other thing is a process thing. Is how do we make it keep working, going forward on a permanent basis? Well, if you look at every state where the conflicts come in K-12, teachers union is one. The superintendents, they've got powerful sort of associations. I won't call them unions, but that's another powerful group. And then the school board association. And then the parents are kind of left out often. They're gaining more power and getting back in. But you got the parents, and then the person that's always missing is the student. The student doesn't have a voice in this whole thing. So we have, at the Department of Education, we have a student advisory board that literally has elementary kids on it. They come together. We have kids from elementary, junior high, and high school come, and they talk about their school experiences, and guess what? We make the adults listen to them. They're the customer. We're doing it for them. Then we took all these other groups that in other states all fight with each other. We passed a law. Usually I'm not into more laws. We passed a law saying we're creating something called the K-12 Coordinating Council, school board, superintendents, teachers, PTA, everybody, they're all on this group. You're required by law to meet. The governor is on there, the independent elected, we're all on this thing, and we have to get in the room together and meet 4 times a year. When we get together and meet and everyone's got their own agenda, then we go, oh, remember, oh, that's right, who are we working for? Oh, we're working for the students. So I've talked to other governors who have never been in the same room with all of those people at the same time. They're often caught when they're fighting with each other, but we basically said, you've got to come together and stop doing this for the adults, you got to do it for the kids. And so that's been a huge driver. And then that group, part of their agenda, required by law, is to introduce a set of things they want the legislature to tackle each year. And so that group is actually agrees on a bunch of stuff before the legislature starts, before they all get together and then hire a bunch of lobbyists to try to kill each other's ideas, and nothing ever changes. Because that's what happens in education. It's so gridlocked. So we found a way to actually create a structure that forces the opponents to sit around the same table and agree on what are you going to do for the kids. And that's I'm sure one of the reasons why our scores are up.
Nice. So back when I first came up here and we started talking about, the cost of college. You mentioned trillions of dollars of student loan debt. Obviously, we're at an all-time high, nearly 40 million borrowers and about 5 million borrowers currently in default. At this point, the Biden administration wants to, write off student loans and do student loan forgiveness programs, which, he's had a little bit of trouble doing. Obviously, I'm not a fan of that issue, and I'm sure you're not either. What alternatives would you propose to reduce student debt and overall the cost of college in itself?
Well, I would just say that higher education's got a whole set of issues, and this is, without any hubris, I would just say this one frustrates me, because when I was in the private sector 4 years before I ever thought about running for governor back in 2012, we were hiring. When we were growing our business, we started with less than 10 kids. We grew to 2,000. We had hired from all of the 11 schools and state schools in North Dakota. We were one of the only employers that had hired somebody from everybody. We'd hired from the private schools. We had a look at the product that was coming out, and we could see what was working and what wasn't. So I got invited to go talk to the State Board of Higher Education and all the university presidents in 2012, and the presentation I said was, basically, you guys are headed into a huge headwind. And there's 4 reasons why. Because technology is going to change everything about what you do. The economics are going to start favoring things other than a 4-year college degree, because people are going to be able to find ways to get stuff done better, faster, cheaper. And with technology, you could even see 10 years ago that remote access was going to be something that was going to start eroding the little fiefdoms they had, because most colleges have some regional competitive advantage of drawing most of their students from an hour away, and kind of having kind of like a monopoly within the little kind of a moat around their castle. And then you had demographics, which is when the country was growing and baby boomers were having babies, there was more kids that were coming out, but we were turning a corner where that was not going to happen. People were getting married later, there was less kids, and so there's going to be less K-12 kids coming out, and demographics is always destiny. It's like, wow, all of these schools are going to be competing for fewer and fewer high school grads, so demographics is an issue. And then culturally, in my era, you'd run into people all the time that would say, I'm the first generation college student of my era. My parents sacrificed and saved, and I'm the first one that came out. And now what you hear parents, and parents were so proud of it, and people would save and they'd help pay for it. Now you hear, parents saying to their kids, wow, I hope you're not going to get buried in student debt and end up living back at my house. So the cultural thing has completely shifted, but that was 10 years ago. And then I said it when I was governor, and I've said it every year since, and I said it before COVID hit, and then COVID came, and those 4 horsemen of technology and demographics and cultural and economics all just got sprinting forward, and the university systems across the country were just blown up. They all realized how vulnerable they were. And if you've got a big endowment and you've got alumni that want to keep things the way they are, that's one thing. But they're not designed to actually adopt and transform. A very few of these higher education, we're going to see a bunch of universities go out of business because of this. So, and why would one of the the women that I worked with for a long time in the private sector became the chief operating officer of the state of North Dakota, which was a new position, but she had industrial engineer operating background. Her daughter got a 4-year degree from a great school and was working in human resources for a big, well-known tech company in California. And she was getting paid, a nice starting salary. This is like 5 years ago. Was getting paid like $60,000 a year. And then she was interviewing people to come to work as coders. And some of the people that she was interviewing didn't have college degrees. They had gone to a 16-week coding school, and they were getting hired in at $75,000 and $80,000. And she's like, I'm sitting here with this college debt I'm trying to pay off. I'm sitting in HR. I'm doing the interviews, and I'm hiring people that didn't go to college because they went to a 16-week coding school. You know what she did? She quit her job and went to the 16-week coding school. And so it's like, this is what I'm saying. There's alternatives now that get you, it used to be you had to have a college degree to have access to a whole bunch of careers. That's not true, because if you have a 4-year degree in computer science, you probably got taught old languages. If you got the 16-week current coding thing, they've taught you all the stuff you need to know right now about the latest tools. And so this is completely disrupting. So K-12 is one thing, higher ed is a completely different thing, and higher ed is going to continue to really struggle. And the fact that the Biden administration was willing to try to forgive $500 billion of debt when you might have had siblings, because I know this case in North Dakota with siblings where one of them went to tech school and got a degree and had no college debt. The other one went to college and piled up a bunch of college debt. And then we're going to take all of your taxpayer dollars and we're going to relieve the debt for the one that went to college but didn't get a job and wasn't paying taxes in. I mean, it's super inflationary, because if you forgive debt, it's the same as printing money. Forgiving $500 billion of debt is like printing $500 billion. Thinking about doing that during a time of high inflation was complete insanity. And then it's the most unfair thing I've seen in terms of it would literally tear families apart if you were going to start doing that. But they keep doing it because it's a payoff to voters that then they think they want to vote for their party. And you think about the $1.6 trillion that those students are saddled with paying back. You know who got that money? The student get that money. It was a pass-through. It went to the student, and the student wrote a check out for tuition. And the schools kept raising their tuition. You look at when they started doing these expanded student loans, and you look at those universities and how they raised their prices. They raised their prices because the federal government was subsidizing it through the loan program. And then they hired more administrators, and then they paid professors that often then, 95% of the professors in this country don't vote Republican. They vote someplace else, but they're getting subsidized by $1.6 trillion of federal spending in the form of a student loan. And because it has the word student in front of it, it's like, oh, we should forgive it. No, they printed money and gave it to universities. That's what they did. It was just, the students just carried the money before they did the handoff. And they saddled these kids. They saddled a whole generation of people that can't go do startups because I was able to think about going and doing a startup when I was a kid because I wasn't buried in student debt. I know kids today that'd be like, well, I'd think about doing a startup, but I can't afford it. I got to keep paying off my student loans.
Thank you. Before we open it up to the audience for questions, I kind of, while you were talking, I thought of something. So I like how you mentioned, alternatives to college. Back when I graduated high school, I graduated in 2019, and back then, our guidance counselors were just pushing the 4-year degree, 4-year degree, 4-year degree. And most people in my graduating class went off to college, but then I found a lot of people that I knew decided to leave their college, come back, and just go right into the workforce. And at least from what I found, I know that at least my perspective of seeing people I knew go off to college far away in other states and then come back is that, college isn't for everybody, and we do need the alternatives. So at this point, I would like to open it up to the audience for questions, and I see one right here. Would you like the mic?
Sure. So first of all, Governor, you have the most impressive education credentials I've probably ever heard from a candidate so far, so thank you for all of that. I really found your youth education board such an interesting concept because 2 years ago, I actually drafted and tried shopping around a bill to create something like that here in the state of New Hampshire, and it didn't go anywhere. This year, though, I wrote a bill to reform our Legislative Youth Advisory Council to have 2 of our members be appointed to the State Board of Education. So we're slowly getting there, and the text of that bill actually just came out today, so I'm very happy about that. 17 years old, and I'm already writing legislation. But I guess my question is more so about we obviously have the federal bureaucracy posing a really big deal with education policy. But when it comes to local policy, when they get in the way, how do we address that? Because in terms of my school, I go to the third worst school in the state, and they've been a major hurdle. So we have extended learning opportunities, so you can get credit for outside the classroom stuff, just like you were talking about, but we can only get up to 5 credits of it and have it count towards graduation. So that's only because the school is way more self-interested and they want you to be sitting in the class, taking the classes, rather than learning on your own. So how do we go about holding them accountable and ensuring that they are working in the student's best interest?
Thanks, James. I'd say most schools operate based on the economics, and I don't know the full thing, but if they are wanting you to, if they're capping the 5 at 5 credits outside, they want you to do this and do that, they're probably because there's a reimbursement system from the state that says they get paid based on the number of student credit hours. So they're going to keep trying to, it's like a factory, and they want to produce more credit hours so they get more pay. And so part of it, to affect the changes that we're talking about, we've got to go back and look at the formula and make sure you're not attempting to do all this cool innovative stuff, but the economics still drive people to create things that trap students in a system that pays the school but doesn't allow for your best education. So that's right. If I was here, that's where I would start looking. But each state, I'm going to have Dawson Scheffner raise his hand in the back. Turn around, James, and take a look at him. Raise your hand again, Dawson. Okay, Dawson in 2020 was the youngest campaign manager in the history of the country to win a gubernatorial race. But many years before that, he actually was one of the first that was on the student advisory board when he was in. When did you start? When you were in high school, Dawson? When he was in high school. So anyway, talk to him, because maybe you got some ideas for new legislation that you could put in here about the student advisory group. Okay.
Any other questions? We have time for probably one more question.
Related to the workforce and education, but also our border, how many skilled work visas with or without sponsors would you increase or keep for the federal government?
Very, very specific question, and I'll stay away from a specific answer. But we do need to increase the skilled worker piece, but there's so many different variants across that. I'll tell you about a couple that I'm deeply familiar with. One is, having been in tech, we've got way too many of the high tech ones. I think there's only about 50. It's been stuck at like 51,000 a year in terms of visas, and those on January 1, all the large tech companies suck all those up. I mean, the big law firms, the big whatever, and you think 51,000 is a big number, but by January 2nd or January 3rd, if you're a software company in Manchester or Fargo, and I know that because the company had in Fargo acquired Real World Hill in Manchester. We had team members that worked in Manchester right along in some of these buildings here, and we would be competing when we were we got to 2,000 people. We were a big software company. We had 1,200 in North America. I mean, 1,200 in Fargo, 400 North America, 400 rest of the world. So we weren't small, but even when we were that size, we couldn't compete with the guys that had 100,000, because they had 500 to 1,000 lawyers. They'd have us all this wired. So then you'd end up like, oh, we got 2 young women that just completed their master's degree from, North Dakota State in Fargo, and we can't get, and they could work for us while they were students because they had a student visa. We couldn't get one of those H-1Bs, we couldn't get one of those for them because everybody else had them. And guess what? So the United States, sends them back to India. So they can do a startup and compete against us as opposed to them working here and staying here and becoming a citizen and raising a family. Well, meanwhile, now Canada, nearby, North Dakota, nearby New Hampshire, they, the last couple of years, have started identifying when we're doing this crazy thing of sending people back who student visas, and they're advertising, and I read a report, they might have picked off 1 million people now from the United States that came from overseas, were here on student visas, getting advanced degrees, working for U.S. companies, and then we're going to send them home, and then Canada says, don't go home, come to us. So they're doing that. And meanwhile, with the open border down there, 6.5 million people since Joe Biden took office, and that's think of every man, woman, and child in all of Maine, all of New Hampshire, all of Vermont, all of Rhode Island, all of Delaware, Joe Biden's home state, and then throw in Montana. That's 6.5 million people. So think if those states had 0 people 2.75 years ago. Now those states are at the population they are now. Then add another 1.5 million of known gotaways, because I've been down there more to the border than Joe Biden has. We've had troops from North Dakota down there throughout my time as governor. 1.5 million where they've been seen on camera. And I've been in the control rooms where there's people walking across, like they got a coyote and 11 people following them, and someone's literally on just writing them down, like counting them. That's our high-tech approach there. We're counting them down like on little markers. That gets you 1.5 million. So now we're up to 8 million people that have come across, and it's just that's absurd. That we would do that. We have to control the border first. That's before we can have any discussion. But the minute we get the border controlled, which we can, with diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, the 4 tools the president has to get it done, we can shut the border down, but then start talking about legal immigration, because we have a workforce issue. We have 10 million jobs available in our country, and it's hurting our economy. It's hurting places like Stark Brewing. It's hurting everywhere. We have to have more workers. But the best and the brightest in the world want to come to us. That's a good thing, right? I mean, we're competing against countries like China that won't let people out. Russia won't let people out. Iran won't let people out. I mean, we're competing against people that have walls to keep people in. This should be an easy competition. But guess what? If we're the best place, if we are, you don't have to be perfect to be exceptional. The United States is exceptional. I've had people working for me around the world who've worked in places where they didn't have the right to vote, they didn't have the right to free speech, they didn't have the right to assemble. And when you see that as a young kid, you start to realize how incredible our country is and say, wow. But if those best and brightest want to come here and join our country, learn the language, pass the citizenship, go through all those processes. Sometimes it could take 7 to 10 years to go through that. Let's have the best and the brightest come here. But the way we're doing it right now, we're sending some of those away, and the door is wide open. And when it's open, when I was down at the border, we had from every country on the terrorist watch list, we had people coming through. Iran, Iraq, Syria, Russia, North Korea, China. I mean, all of those. The one sector I was in, there was over 100 countries where people had come across just in the previous quarter. So it is the most unreported story every single day in this country. October, again, 250,000 people. Think of, it's like 2 Manchesters walked into our country in October. And it was, and you looked on page 18 to even find a story about it. But it's still happening. So there's lots to fix on there, but that's job one. The federal government does a bunch of stuff that's not their job. Education's not part of it. 10th Amendment, very clear. National security. National security means secure the borders. You can't have national security without border security, so that's got to be one of the things the federal government actually gets done. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stick around. I know you're going to close out, I think. Chris, you coming back up or right here? What are we doing? But I just want to, again, I'll take a moment to say thank you to all of you for coming tonight. It's been incredible, your gift of time that you're giving all of us. Appreciate the questions. Catherine and I will be around, happy to grab photos with anybody or happy to answer any additional questions. But you matter. The first in the nation primary matters, and voters like yourselves that come out and get educated matter, and this is the best of America happening right here when people come together and are willing to spend time learning about how we can solve some of the biggest challenges facing us. I'm an optimist. I believe that we can solve all these challenges. I believe that it's incredible ahead of us, and I believe for the young people that are here, if you're under 25, you're going to live to be 100, because we're going to solve all the major disease problems that are facing people. I mean, the world is going to be an incredible future, but it's going to depend on a direction starting in the White House, and that's why we're running, is because we know that America, we know that what the best of America looks like. We know that by getting it right on economy, energy, national security, education, we get that right, we can improve every American life. We can bring out the best American. We can have another amazing American century. So thanks for including us tonight.
Thank you so much, Governor. I'm going to pass it off now to Chris.
Thank you. Just want to say thank you as well on behalf of New Hampshire College Republicans, New Hampshire Young Republicans, and the American Conservation Coalition Action. These really are the issues that matter to young people in this country, so thank you for your time, for sharing your vision for the future. I think we need to build an economy that works for all Americans. We need to protect the environment while growing that economy, and we need to make sure that the education system is fixed. So thank you again. We'll be hosting more events, so keep an eye out. and have a good night.
There's a girl and a guy in a truck.